You're listening to the N2K Space Network.
And now, a word from our sponsor, NordPass. NordPass is an advanced password manager from the team behind NordVPN, designed to help keep your business safe from data leaks and cyber threats. It gives your IT professionals control over who has access to your company's data and makes it easy for everyone else on your team to use strong passwords. Right now, you can go to www.nordpass.com/cyberwire for 35% off the NordPass Business Yearly Plan. Don't miss out on that.
Hi, I'm Maria Varmazes, host of the T- Space Daily podcast, and you're listening to T- Overview.
T-minus 20 seconds to LOS.
In this program, we'll feature some of the conversations from our daily podcast with the people who are forging the path in the new space era, from industry leaders, technology experts and pioneers, to educators, policymakers, researchers, and more. In this episode, we're going to meet two people who are working to preserve lesser-known aspects of space history. Many scientific institutions and museums work hard to share stories from the space race and beyond, and space experts and enthusiasts have taken up the mantle to educate the public about missions that are long forgotten or misunderstood. But no matter who serves as a historical guide, it does take a steadfast dedication to the mission and the people who made it happen. Dave Williams is in charge of the NASA Space Science Data Coordinated Archive. But when an email about the moon trees ended up in his mailbox, he decided to do some digging. Figuratively, of course. What happened to the Apollo moon trees? Here's his story.
So back in 1971, Apollo 14 flew to the moon. It was the third mission that made it to the moon. It was right after Apollo 13, which of course was the mission that failed, and luckily everyone made it back. So all eyes were kind of on Apollo 14. But one of the astronauts, the command module pilot, who was the one who did not go down to the moon, Stuart Roosa, had worked for the Forest Service previously to joining NASA. And as part of that, he decided, along with some of his colleagues at the Forest Service, that he was going to bring tree seeds up with him to orbit the moon. And so he put them in his personal kit. He took about 500 tree seeds that were selected by the Forest Service, took them up inside his personal kit, brought them around the moon, brought them back to Earth, gave them back to the Forest Service. They germinated the trees, and then they sent them all over the country in 1976 for the bicentennial, and they planted them just all over the country. And then it sort of got kind of forgotten.
Which is an interesting mystery to be solving.
It's very interesting. It's been fascinating all these years. I assumed that they took the seeds up, they kept careful records of where they were planted and everything like that, and it didn't work that way. It didn't work that way for a few reasons. One, it was really a public relations thing. It wasn't really a science experiment. It was definitely a public relations kind of thing. Two, it was basically there were three different entities involved, and it got very confusing. So for obviously NASA, and then the Forest Service, but then the Forest Service handed these trees out to the seedlings, once they'd grown them, to various state governments. So in other words, there was no real connection, and so there was no real systematic record keeping. In other words, they sort of went to the state. Maybe the Forest Service knew that it sent, 3 trees to Montana, but what happened to them after that? If the state didn't keep track of them, the records are gone, and that's what happened for most of them. So somewhere in the communications, records just sort of got lost, or the trail got lost.
Okay, so that does fill in some pieces for me because I thought it was a science mission. I was thinking, was there thoughts about like, would the germination be different if, now that the seeds have been to space, or would the trees look different? Do they look different now that they're mature? I mean, what do we know about them?
But they did try to grow, they saved some seeds behind to try to grow control trees to see if there was any difference. No one expected there to be a difference. And that's why it really wasn't a science experiment, because it would have been amazing if these tree seeds had gone into space for a week, basically, and come back and been changed. And there were, with the astronaut the whole time. I mean, so what would that have said if there was that much effect from radiation or zero gravity or something on these little seeds, and there's an astronaut sitting in the exact same environment? So
yeah,
so they kind of knew, right? They kind of knew that space wasn't going to, make an astronaut start glowing or grow tentacles. And so they didn't expect anything to happen to the trees.
Yeah, that is very encouraging. I mean, again, it would make one wonder about our humans in space if that would be the difference. But it is also fascinating to hear that it was a bit of a, you've got this, no, you've got this, no, you've got, you figure it out kind of a situation with the trees. And that, people were just kind of like, it's nice, but we're not going to track it. That's kind of funny. I never would have expected that.
I know. Well, okay. So there's the other part of that too is, the Apollo program actually ended pretty abruptly. I mean, 14, there was 15, 16, 17, and then they were like, okay, we can't afford it anymore. They had plans for more Apollo missions. So, once it ended, I mean, it's kind of like everyone left the party and went their own ways, and they lost track of a lot of stuff. In fact, part of my job is I'm still looking for some, bits and pieces of Apollo data that either documentation or, various things that weren't quite saved as well as they should have been. So there is that too. Anyway, they did lose track. Yeah.
So how did you find out about the moon trees in general? Because I think I've heard some versions of the story. I'm not sure if it's correct, but it involves a Girl Scout. Do I have this right? You tell me about this. My kid's a Girl Scout, so I'm just like, I'm dying to know.
Oh yeah, no. This is one of the things. If you told me when I started working at NASA that I'd be, this story, I'd be like, what? No, that's not right. Anyway, no. So in 1996, I got an email. Now I told you I'm archiving and restoring data from the old missions, and so my name was on a lot of pages for the Apollo mission. So I got an email in 1996 from this third grade teacher in Kennelton, Indiana, named Joan Goebel, and she said their class is doing this project on sort of local historic trees. And there was a Girl Scout in the class who said there's a tree at their Girl Scout camp, and it has a sign on it, and it says it's a moon tree. And Joan said, I don't know anything else about this except someone said it has something to do with the Apollo mission. So I'm like, okay, I never heard of moon trees. But, okay, let me see what I can find out. I asked around. I mean, in 1996, I'm at Goddard Space Flight Center. There's an awful lot of folks around there, especially at that time, who were, it's kind of the old timers who actually knew about the Apollo, were involved in the Apollo program. So I started asking around. I was like, oh, we're at these moon trees on Apollo. And I got the best looks. No. They're like, yeah, sure, Dave. Thanks. I don't know what you're talking about. I never heard of these moon trees. I couldn't find anything. No one knew anything about them. I got online on the web. Now in 1996, of course, the web was a little
very rudimentary web. Yes, I remember it well. Yes. Yep.
You could find some things, and I found a little bit about it. And then I also contacted the NASA History Office, and they sent me they had a little file there with a couple news clippings on the moon trees. So I had enough to kind of piece it together. And I figured, and I found out, okay, so it was Stuart Roosa. It was on Apollo 14. He brought these tree seeds. They brought them back. And I got enough of the story. I could answer Joan as much as I could. And then it's like, okay, I've done that. I've answered that email. And I thought, but this is such a cool story and no one knows about it. I mean, like I said, people I talked to, even who were around at Apollo, didn't know about this. So I'm like, well, I hate this to get lost. I have these web pages about the Apollo missions. I said, I'm going to stuff it in there. It doesn't belong to the science archiving, but we have some latitude to do, public outreach, that sort of thing. So I made up some pages. About the moon trees and what little I knew. I should say pages, probably one page. I fit everything I knew on one page. And I had about 6 trees, I think, at that point, that from various news clippings and what I found online. So I put those the list of these 6 trees on there. And I put a note at the bottom. I said, hey, if you know about a moon tree, here's my email. Please let me know about it. And I started getting emails. Oh, we've got a tree in our local park. It has this plaque. I never knew what this was. It says it's a moon tree, and it was planted in the bicentennial in 1976. And I started getting all these messages. People would send me pictures. People would, some people sent stories about they remembered the moon tree being planted, or things like that. Newspaper clippings. So it started coming together. And then I started hearing from some people, stumbled across it from the Forest Service. And then I started from people who actually worked on it. And I got from them. And then I actually heard, now Stuart Roosa had passed away in 1994, so just before this. But I actually started getting emails from his family.
Oh, wow.
And then that was amazing. I remember the first one I got from his son, Jack, and he said, oh, this is, I just took my daughters to see the moon tree. And he said, this is very special to me. You see, I'm Stuart Roosa's son. I was like, oh my gosh.
Yeah. A connection to his father. Oh, that's really sweet.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So anyway, I got a lot of the background from, the Forest Service people, Stan Krugman and these guys. And I got stuff from Stuart Roosa's family. And the story really started coming together. And now I've, it's 100 and something trees there that people have sent me information and pictures about. And it's been kind of amazing. It just kind of blew up.
But quick back of the napkin math, a lot of them are still status unknown. Like so if there was 500 seeds, assuming all 500 germinated, only, or did I do that math right? Or maybe I'm misunderstanding. So how?
No. Well, there's more of the story. When they first came back, the 500 seeds, when they first came back, NASA tried to plant, well, they planted about half of them. Well, what happened was actually, even before that, when they came back, they tried to decontaminate them. They decontaminated everything that came off Apollo. Now, Apollo 14 was actually the last one they did that for. And then they said, you know what, there's nothing on the moon we have to worry about. But the seeds got thrown into a decontamination chamber. And part of it was they put them under a vacuum. Well, the seeds were in these little plastic bags. And for some reason, they had opened up the canister before they put it in there. So the bags all burst. So the seeds flew all over the chamber.
Oh, my God.
Right. And these were explosively exposed to a vacuum. So no one knew what was going to happen. I mean, who would do that? No one's done experiments with tree seeds that I know of to just, explosively expose them to a vacuum. I mean, but no one knew if they would survive.
Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah,
that's right. So no one knew if they survived, but Stan Krugman went and said, just sweep them up and give them to me. Now these seeds, 500 in this they're teeny things. He went through all of them and sorted them. He sorted out the redwoods. He sorted out the Douglas fir seeds. And then they germinated. They tried to germinate a whole bunch of them to make sure they were okay. Well, they did grow, but unfortunately at NASA, they really didn't have the facilities to keep them alive. So after about a year, they died. So about half, roughly half. I mean, I don't know how many. No one, I haven't been able to find it, but a lot of them died. And they said, and the Forest Service and NASA said, hey, NASA said, we can't do this. And the Forest Service give them to us. So they sent the rest of the seeds to the Forest Service. And then the Forest Service germinated and grew them. So there's some good records, like, for example, for the redwoods, there's really good records. And I haven't been able to find records for some of the other ones. So I don't know exactly how many, but there's at least, I would guess at least a few hundred got sent out to the various states and stuff. They were trying to send out at least 3 to every state, or almost every state. They want to grow in some places. But
well, Dave, is there anything else you wanted to share with our audience today? I know I've taken up a ton of your time, but I've loved learning about this, so thank you so much.
Oh, geez, don't know. I always love talking about the movies. I mean, let me see. Is there anything like really important that I didn't mention? I mean, there's so many little stories and things with them. But
do you have a favorite you want to share? I mean, I'm sure you've got so many, but anything that comes to mind? Oh
boy, let's see. Well, okay, I will tell you the funny one that involves me, and that is when I first put up the webpage, and I put up my 6 trees, and I started hearing from people, and I said, oh, well, here's another tree, and here's another tree, and I started adding to it. I was probably up for maybe 6 months or so, and I got a call from someone at Goddard, and they said, why don't you have the Goddard moon tree on your page? and I said, there's a Goddard moon tree? not the world's greatest detective. So sure enough, there is a tree at the visitor center, a moon tree, first generation moon tree that was planted at Goddard, and it does have a little sign. Now, it is off to the side. It is not along a path. There's no way to get to it unless you kind of walk across the grass. So if you noticed it, and obviously at least someone did noticed it and walked across to see what it said. There's a sign and it said the moon tree and it was planted and it went on the Apollo 14. And but that was too funny. I'm like, okay, great. I'm the world's foremost expert on moon trees, except for the one that's
literally in your backyard. Well, I'm glad that I can verify. Indeed, it is there. I see it on the list. That's great. Well, you never know. There might be one that someone has been walking by and they go, "Oh, moon tree. Who knows what that means?" And now they'll know that someone's looking for it.
I'm always hoping, and I have a few. If you look on the list too, that are sort of status unknown because I've gotten either a newspaper clipping or information from some archive. An intern at the New York State Archives a couple of years ago just got interested in this and found a whole bunch of stuff at the archives and sent it to me. It was great. I mean, he just sort of decided, he'd do this, as part of his internship or something, and he found a bunch of the details. So there were supposedly 4 trees sent to New York State, but I can't find evidence of any of them. But there's all these letters about it. They were, the seedlings were shipped there, and they had these plans to plant them here and there and the other thing, and then that's it. I can't find another thing, which is, not atypical of what happens with these things.
Yeah.
The trail just goes cold.
Huh. Well, maybe some of our New Yorker listeners can, if they know anything. Yeah, I'm looking. I'm like, all of them are status unknown.
No, I heard not too long ago, someone sent me a clipping about one in Maryland, and so I went to see, and I couldn't find any sycamores where it was supposed to be. It was supposedly a sycamore was planted there. Couldn't find any sycamores there. But I did get in touch with someone, and I'm hoping to maybe get a little more information about that. So yeah, it's still still ongoing stuff.
Rachel Tillman grew up in the space industry and watched her father's work on the Viking missions to Mars. As an adult, she took it on herself to preserve the story of those missions to share with future generations.
I'm the founder and director of the Viking Mars Missions Education and Preservation Project. And what we do is we preserve the history, artifacts, oral histories of all the individuals of all genders that worked on the Viking mission to the surface and orbital space of Mars in the 1970s. I came into this mission because of my father, who was a scientist on the mission, and I was very interested at a very young age in life on Mars because people were always asking that question as we ventured into the Viking space more and more deeply. So,
for people who, now I would like to think that everyone listening to the show knows about the Vikings, but a lot of people don't, and as I know you've encountered. So let's just start there. Tell me about the Vikings.
The mission itself launched in 1975 and landed on the surface of Mars after being in orbit for a number of days in 1976. So July 20th, 1976. It did not land on July 4th, which was the intended date, but instead we had to do a recertification, a resite certification, because the orbiters of Viking were vastly greater than those of Mariner 9, which was used to select the original landing sites. So during the orbit entry date and the landing date, the teams kicked into high gear to do recertification of not just one Viking lander, but 2, because we launched 2 vehicles, 2 orbiters, and had 2 landers ready to perform immense amounts of science about the atmosphere and the surface of Mars. So I call it 6 out of 6 because the launch vehicles are equally important. Titan 3E with a Centaur front end. So many people collaborated to work on that, not just NASA. Most NASA missions are about 10 to 20, maybe 30% NASA, and the other 70 to 90% are actually not NASA employees. They are scientists like my father at the University of Washington, colleges and universities and educational institutes all across the world, not just in the United States. So it was a multinational mission, despite the fact that it was not represented that way. And the basis of the science, instrumentation, design, the landing and EDL, the atmospheric data that we had during the process of being of actually flying to Mars and entering, were all supplemented by individuals from all around the world, including at the time the Soviet Union, who, despite the Cold War, the scientists were surreptitiously communicating back and forth to each other. And we even have letters from the Soviet Union Mars 3 team members saying, hey, we just had our attempt to land. This is what we've learned, yada, yada. So incredible collaboration all across the globe to make these missions 6 out of 6.
That's amazing. And I know with all these missions, especially these early missions, it's kind of hard to be like, give me a high level of what we learned, because we learned so much and we always do. But I mean, if you had to give it like a headline, here's what we got out of the Vikings. What did we learn? What did we take away from them?
Well, it was represented by the media as the search for life on Mars. And that's wrong in so many ways, because number one, we weren't searching for life. We were searching for biologic organics. So those of us who are in the science world, we get kind of geeky about this. And we don't use words like soil, which has the implications of actually having extant organics, biologic organics. We use the word regolith because we didn't know at that time. So we were looking for biologic organics, but we were also trying to understand the elemental characteristics of the planet, including the physical properties. We used an X-ray fluorescent system to examine the minerals on the surface. We used my father's and his team, of course, or the Seymour Hess's team, which my father served on, to study the atmospheric sciences. So the temperature, the humidity, the wind speed, all kinds of detailed science. We had 2 seismometers, one on each lander, and they're incredibly sensitive instruments. If you looked at them, you would notice that one of the most important parts of it is it's like I don't know what 0.1 micron wire that goes between these 2 things. It looks a bit like those, toothpick things to help you flush your teeth now. Very much like that.
Yeah, yep.
Just for reference. And the only instrument that had any issues upon landing was one seismometer out of all of the instruments. So we had GCMS, which was the chemical properties, the biology instruments, of which there were 3. Again, we had imaging, we had X-ray fluorescence, we had radio technologies that were being tested at the time. We had both a high band antenna so an S-band and a low gain antenna. So we were actually studying how do we communicate with things that are on Mars? Can we communicate both directly and indirectly through the orbiters and without the orbiters from point to point? We successfully did both. So the amount of things that we learned was immense just from a scientific standpoint. However, the equally important piece of Viking was the engineering discoveries, and that included almost all elements of the EDL, the entry, descent, and landing. So the Vikings actually created the disc gap band parachute, which is the only parachute that successfully could withstand the forces of descent after the pyrotechnic separation from the aeroshell. The initial part of the landing was with the aeroshell, which was turned not just into a protective heat shield, which is what aeroshells were in the past, but it was actually turned into an aero-braking system using ablative technologies so that the force of the entry, of the speed was reduced by turning that force into the ablation of materials on the exterior side of the shell. And that itself decelerated until it reached a point at which the parachutes could then handle the capacity of that, the remaining force to be deployed and then slow down the lander additionally. until we came to the third element of the EDL, and that was the very first throttleable autonomous AI intelligent landing systems before Blue Origin, before SpaceX.
1976, right?
1976. So let's just get a little perspective there. So we did all of those things. And those engineering precedents actually succeeded in setting the standard for all Mars entry. And it has been used in every mission since then, with the exception of Pathfinder, which tried out this other really fun landing system, which was the bouncy balloon.
The bouncy ball.
The bouncy ball. And that did work, but we did return to the Viking model after that. Really, those successes were not just scientific successes, but engineering. And that includes computing. So the computing industry kind of grew up with Viking and vice versa. Well, no, it grew up with Viking. Viking was a sequencer, not a parallel processor. So there were, in fact, no computers on board Viking. There was a sequencer.
Okay, can you do, you just got my computer science brain a little bit like, okay, what do we mean by that? Tell me a little more about that.
Sequencing is what it sounds like, right? Sequencing is one command after another being processed, executed, waiting for another command. Parallel processing are multiple sequences occurring simultaneously and, if you're clever enough, interacting with each other and influencing the next sequence.
Kind of what we think of as today. Yeah, like kind of what we do today.
The difference between parallel, that's what we do today. Everything we do today is parallel or more.
Or much more, yeah. We got quantum now. We're
way off the parallel. But interestingly, even those advances came from Vikings. So the parallel processing technologies actually were developed by individuals that were working on the Viking computing systems.
I don't doubt it at all. It's amazing. Yeah, that's where a lot of those things were pushed forward, really.
Oh, yes. CCDs and cameras, all kinds of things were developed from Viking and then have served other, both earthly and other planetary problem-solving, missions.
I love learning about these kinds of things through people like yourself who are putting in so much work. And I mean, because this is not just, it is clearly also a personal thing for you, which I think is wonderful. But you're also doing a ton of work. Aside from knowing all this stuff, you're also doing, the Viking Preservation Project. You sort of touched on a lot of what you're doing, a lot of that educational outreach, but you mentioned earlier before we started recording that you do a lot of interviews with people who worked on the Vikings. So please tell me more about that. Well,
really, what I decided before founding the nonprofit itself was that if I'm going to preserve the history of the mission, what is the most important asset? And that asset is the people that worked on it. The individuals that worked on Viking solved the problems, ran into challenges, collaborated, worked together, setting different organizational structures that have never been reproduced since then. And I'll tell a little bit more about that later. And so I decided early on that the most important thing I could do was collect as many oral histories as I possibly could before people pass away. So recording their oral histories was the most important thing I could do. And I've done probably over 300 interviews at this point. And I'm looking for people that worked on Viking in any capacity. You do not have to be a rock star type A personality. I did this. In fact, if you're the person that doesn't talk about what you do, or if you know somebody that worked on Viking, call me, email me, let me know, because I want to hear from every single individual that worked on the mission. Everybody knows.
A very special thank you to our guests today, Dave Williams and Rachel Tillman. If you're interested in hearing more about the space industry, join me every day for T- Space Daily, available on all major podcast platforms. Find out more at space.n2k.com. We'd love to know what you think of this show. You can email us at space@n2k.com. Your feedback ensures we deliver the information that keeps you a step ahead in the rapidly changing space industry. This episode was produced by Alice Carruth. Our associate producer is Liz Stokes. We are mixed by Elliot Peltzman and Trey Hester, with original music by Elliot Peltzman. Our executive producer is Jennifer Eiben. Our executive editor is Brandon Karp. Simone Petrella is our president. Peter Kilpie is our publisher. And I'm your host, Maria Varmazes. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.
T-minus.
The IT world used to be simpler. You only had to secure and manage environments that you controlled. Then came new technologies and new ways to work. Now, employees, apps, and networks are everywhere. This means poor visibility, security gaps, and added risk. That's why Cloudflare created the first-ever connectivity cloud. Visit cloudflare.com to protect your business everywhere you do business.